Sign the papers on a Tuesday morning right there in the driveway, with the Hendersons from next door watching from their front porch, pretending to water plants that hadn't needed watering in weeks. My husband of 11 years, held out a manila envelope and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, I had my attorney draw these up last week. You have 48 hours to clear out your things. Celeste's name goes on the deed by Friday. Celeste's. He said her name like it was a gift he was giving himself. I took the envelope. I looked at it. Then I looked at him. At the new haircut, the gym clothes he'd started wearing on weekends, the way he was standing with his chest out like he'd rehearsed this moment in the bathroom mirror. And I smiled. Not because I was hiding the pain. I was in pain. 11 years is 11 years. And the man standing in my driveway, performing his own liberation for the neighborhood, was still the person I'd driven to the ER at 2 in the morning when he thought he was having a heart attack, who turned out to be having a panic attack about a quarterly review. I knew that man. I had loved that man. But I smiled because I knew something he didn't. And I knew he was about to find out. His name is Todd. He's 44, a regional sales director for a mid-sized logistics company outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, and for the first 9 years of our marriage, he was a decent husband. Not remarkable, not romantic, but steady, predictable. The kind of man who remembered to change the HVAC filter and forgot your birthday, but felt genuinely bad about it afterward. I'm Diane. I'm 41. I spent 12 years as a paralegal at a commercial real estate firm before I got my broker's license and started doing property acquisitions on my own. Small stuff at first. A duplex in Concord, a strip of commercial units in Kannapolis. Then bigger. I was quiet about it because Todd had complicated feelings about money, specifically about me making more of it than he did. And I had learned early in our marriage that the path of least resistance was to keep certain things separate. My accounts, my work, my plans. I'm not proud of how much I accommodated him, but I understood it at the time as preservation. You make small concessions to keep the peace, and then one day you look up and you've made so many small concessions that the peace you've been keeping isn't really a life anymore. I started to notice things around February of last year. He started going to the gym at 6 in the morning, which he had never done in 11 years. He started using a password on his phone, which he had also never done. He bought new cologne, something dark and expensive that definitely was not a choice he made alone, and he started getting phone calls he'd take in the garage with the door down. I didn't say anything for a while. I kept working. I kept cooking dinner. I kept being the person who scheduled the pest control and remembered to call his mother on her birthday. Then in March, a friend of mine who works in HR at a staffing agency mentioned, casually, that she had processed paperwork for a new contract employee named Celeste Varro, who had listed my husband's work email as a professional reference. I asked her to describe Celeste. She did. 29. Marketing background, originally from Raleigh. I thanked her and went home and sat in my car in the garage for about 40 minutes. Then I got to work. I have a friend named Pauline. We met at a real estate licensing course 7 years ago, and she is the kind of woman who knows everybody and is known by everybody and is known by everybody, and I mean that in the best possible way. She moved in certain circles, financial, legal, the kind of quiet money world where information traveled in whispers and favors. She had also, about 4 years before, gone through a divorce that had nearly bankrupted her before she figured out what her ex-husband had been doing with their joint assets. I called Pauline on a Thursday night and told her what I knew. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Pauline, and when I finished she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me about Celeste." I told her what little I knew. 29. Marketing. Raleigh. Contract employee. That's interesting. Pauline said. I know a Celeste Varro, or I know of her. She came up about 2 years ago in a situation involving a man in my financial advisor's network. He thought he was co-investing in a boutique hotel project with her. She turned out to have very flexible ideas about what co-investing meant. I asked what happened. He lost about $60,000 in his marriage, Pauline said. She moved on. He never pursued charges because he was embarrassed. I sat with that for a moment. She does this, I said. It wasn't a question. It looks that way, Pauline said. The question is, how many times? And whether you want to find out before or after you let her put her name on your deed. I want to be clear about something. I am not a vindictive person by nature. I genuinely believe that. The people who know me well would tell you I'm methodical, careful, sometimes frustratingly calm. What I am is thorough. When I decide to do something, I do it completely. Over the next 6 weeks, I did it completely. Pauline connected me with a woman named Harriet, a retired financial crimes investigator who now did private consulting work. Harriet was 63, barely 5 feet tall, and had the energy of someone who had been waiting their entire career for a case like this to fall into her lap. Harriet found 3 additional men in the Carolinas and Virginia who had encountered Celeste Varro in a romantic context within the last 4 years. In each case, the pattern was almost identical. She targeted men in their 40s with decent incomes and complicated marriages. She moved fast. Within weeks, she was talking about the future. She introduced financial conversations early, investments, joint ventures, business opportunities she was developing. She borrowed money in ways that felt like sharing, and when the man was sufficiently attached and sufficiently exposed, things got complicated. One man, a contractor in Greensboro, had transferred $42,000 to an LLC she controlled before realizing the LLC had no assets and no activity other than receiving transfers. Another, a financial planner in Asheville, had signed a document he thought was a partnership agreement for a consulting business. He told Harriet he still wasn't sure what he'd actually signed. The third was quieter about the details. He'd lost his marriage and a chunk of his retirement savings. He just wanted it to stop. None of them had reported her formally. They were all embarrassed. They were all men who had made choices they didn't want examined in public. I understood that. I also understood that their silence had enabled this to continue. I called each of them. I introduced myself. I explained what I was doing and what I had found. I told them I wasn't asking them to relive anything painful unless they chose to, but I was asking them to be available if I needed them. All 3 said yes. Meanwhile, Todd was apparently accelerating his own timeline. He came home one evening in April smelling like a restaurant I hadn't been to with him and announced that he was thinking about refinancing the house. We owned the house jointly, had since we bought it 8 years ago. I had, in fact, made the larger down payment because I had saved more. I listened to him talk about interest rates and equity with an expression I had practiced keeping neutral, and I said I'd think about it. He also mentioned with elaborate casualness that he'd been restructuring some of our joint savings for tax purposes. I asked him to elaborate. He said his financial advisor had recommended moving some funds. I asked which financial advisor. He named someone I'd never heard of. I called Pauline that night. He's moving the money, I told her. I know, she said. I saw something flagged this afternoon. One of my contacts at the credit union called me. Todd initiated a wire transfer of $48,000 to an account in Celeste's LLC last week. I put the phone down on the counter for a moment. Then I picked it back up. How much is in our joint accounts right now? I asked. Including the money market account, about $112,000, Pauline said. But Diane, there's something else. I waited. The LLC Celeste controls. The one your husband just wired money to. It transferred $30,000 of that to a second LLC 3 days later. That second LLC is registered in Delaware. I don't have a beneficial owner yet, but Harriet is working on it. She's layering it, I said. That's what it looks like, Pauline said. I hung up and walked to my home office and opened a folder I kept in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. In it was a copy of a deed. The deed to 4217 Millbrook Ridge Road, the address where Todd and I lived, where he had just told the Hendersons next door that he was giving to Celeste by Friday. My name was on that deed. His name was on that deed. But there was another deed in that folder. For property on the other side of Charlotte. A commercial building on a corner lot in a neighborhood that had been slowly gentrifying for 5 years. I had purchased it quietly through one of my LLCs 14 months before Todd and I got married. I had refinanced it twice. I had 3 commercial tenants. The building was currently appraised at just over $900,000. Todd did not know this building existed. I filed the divorce paperwork myself 2 days after he handed me that envelope in the driveway. I used an attorney, a woman named Rebecca, who came highly recommended by Pauline and who had a specific subspecialty I needed, financial forensics in marital dissolution cases. Rebecca was measured and precise and did not waste words. Her first question was, "What are we working with?" I gave her the folder. She looked through it for a long time. Then she looked up at me. "The building was purchased pre-marriage," she asked. 14 months prior, I said. "And it has been held exclusively in your LLC since acquisition." "No marital funds commingled?" "None," I said. "Separate account, separate LLC, separate everything." She nodded slowly. "Then this is not a marital asset." "I know," I said. "He has no claim to it." "I know that too," I said. Then I told her about the wire transfer, about the LLC in Delaware, about Harriet's 3 other men, about the pattern. Rebecca set down her pen and looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite read. "This isn't just a divorce case," she said. "No," I agreed. "It isn't." Harriet found the Delaware LLC beneficial owner on a Friday afternoon. It was Celeste with a second name I didn't recognize. A man with a Florida address who, Harriet told me, had a prior civil judgment against him for fraud in a real estate transaction in 2019. This was no longer a woman having an affair with a married man. This was an operation. I drove to the Charlotte field office of the FBI on a Monday morning. I brought a binder. It had tabs. The agent I met with, a quiet man in his early 50s who introduced himself as Agent Whitmore, looked through the binder without speaking for almost 20 minutes. Then he asked me 3 questions. I answered them. He excused himself. He came back with a colleague. "Ms. Diane," he said, "I want you to understand we can't confirm or deny the existence of an investigation at this time." I told him I understood, but I'd ask you to be very careful about taking any unilateral legal action that might complicate things. I told him I would be careful. He paused. "Your attorney's aware of this meeting." "She is," I said. He nodded. "Good." Todd moved Celeste into the house 2 weeks later. I had already moved my important documents and a few personal items to Pauline's. I let him think I had nowhere else to go. I let him think the envelope in the driveway had worked exactly the way he planned. Celeste walked through my house with the particular energy of a woman who has convinced herself she has won something. She rearranged the furniture in the living room. She replaced the dish soap. She put a diffuser on the kitchen counter that made the whole house smell like eucalyptus. Todd texted me to ask if I had found a situation. I told him I was staying with a friend and working through things. He replied with a thumbs-up emoji. 11 years and I got a thumbs-up emoji. I saved the text. Rebecca had filed for equitable distribution and had flagged the unauthorized wire transfer as dissipation of marital assets. In North Carolina, dissipation, spending or transferring marital assets for a non-marital purpose, especially during the breakdown of a marriage, is factored into property division. The $48,000 Todd had sent to Celeste's LLC was now a legal problem for him. His attorney, it turned out, had not been told about the wire transfer. I know this because when Rebecca raised it in our first mediation session, Todd's attorney turned to look at his client with the specific expression of a person who has just learned they have been walking into something they were not prepared for. Todd tried to explain. He said it was a business investment. Rebecca asked him to describe the business. He couldn't because Celeste had never actually explained it to him. She had just told him it was a promising opportunity and that her contacts would make it worthwhile. Rebecca asked him to produce the investment agreement. There wasn't one. Celeste was not at the mediation. But she found out about it. And whatever she had told Todd about the situation, whatever version of events she had constructed for him, it started to crack. He called me that night. First time he had called me since the driveway. "What did you tell them?" he asked. "The truth," I said. "What truth? Diane, you're making things up too." "Todd," I said, "I need you to listen to me carefully. The woman living in our house right now has done this before. At least 3 times that I can document. And Harriet thinks there are more. She targets men. She builds a financial connection. She moves money. When it gets difficult, she leaves." Silence. "She showed me the investment prospectus," he said finally, but his voice had gone uncertain. "What LLC is it registered under?" I asked. Longer silence. "She said it was still being formalized," he said. "I let that sit there between us. I'm not your enemy, Todd," I said, and I meant it, even then, even after the driveway and the thumbs-up emoji and the eucalyptus diffuser. But I'm going to protect myself, and I'm going to tell the truth. You should probably talk to your attorney before you say anything else." He talked to his attorney. His attorney apparently had a very clarifying conversation with Todd, because 2 days later, Todd asked Celeste to leave. I am told, and this is secondhand from the Hendersons, who could not contain themselves, that Celeste did not leave quietly, that there were raised voices, that Todd was heard saying something about the LLC and Celeste was heard saying something about "you knew what this was," that a neighbor on the far end of the street called the non-emergency police line just to document the noise. I was not there for it. I was at Pauline's drinking coffee on her back porch. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Todd. "She's gone. I think I need to talk to a lawyer who isn't mine." I put the phone face down on the porch table and looked at the tree line for a while. The full picture came together over the following 2 months. Harriet's final count was 5 men in 4 states. The total in documented financial losses was just over $230,000, not including what Todd had transferred. The Delaware LLC had been used to move money to 3 separate accounts, 2 of which had been partially drained before the accounts were flagged. Agent Whitmore called Rebecca's office in July. I was not given details, but the phrase "ongoing federal investigation" was used, which meant certain things would be handled at a level that did not require me to be the one pressing charges. The 3 other men, the contractor from Greensboro, the financial planner from Asheville, the quieter one whose name I had agreed to keep private, all gave statements. They all told me afterward they felt something loosen when they did, like they had been carrying the embarrassment alone for years and had finally been allowed to put it down. I understood that feeling. Todd and I reached a settlement in September. He kept the house, or rather, he kept the mortgage and the obligation that went with it, because the equity had been substantially reduced by the dissipation finding. He received a portion of the joint retirement accounts as structured by the agreement. He received nothing from my commercial property because it was not a marital asset and had never been. He did not fight me on the property. I think his attorney had explained very carefully why he should not try. The building on the corner lot in Charlotte, the one he didn't know existed, the one I had been tending quietly for 11 years while I was also tending the marriage, is currently 90% occupied. I recently signed a new anchor tenant, a regional healthcare company that is taking the entire 2nd floor. The building is now appraised at just over $1.2 million. I did not tell Todd this. I'm living in a rental now while I figure out what I want next. A clean 2-bedroom in a neighborhood I like, with good light in the mornings and a coffee shop I can walk to. I have a standing Friday lunch with Pauline, who is already angling to co-invest on a mixed-use property in the Node district. I have been sleeping well. I think about that driveway sometimes. The Hendersons watching from the porch. Todd with his chest out. The manila envelope. I think about the version of me who stood there and smiled when she probably should have cried. And I don't think she was cold or calculated. I think she was someone who had been doing quiet work for a long time and knew that the work was solid. I think she was someone who had stopped performing helplessness to make someone else comfortable. There is a particular kind of pain that comes from being underestimated by someone who was supposed to know you. Todd looked at me in that driveway and saw a woman with nothing to fall back on. He saw someone whose entire life was the house, the marriage, the continuity of a relationship that he was now ending. He had no idea who he was talking to. I think that's what I keep coming back to. Not the anger. The anger faded faster than I expected. Not even the satisfaction of the settlement, which was real but not sweet in the way I had imagined. What I keep coming back to is that smile. Because that smile was not a performance. It was just the truth of the situation rising to the surface. He thought he was taking everything from me. He had actually taken nothing. Everything I had built was still there, quiet and solid, exactly where I had left it. The morning the settlement was finalized, I drove to the building on the corner lot. I parked on the street and looked at it for a few minutes. The brick facade, the new windows I'd had installed on the third floor last spring, the small bronze number plate by the main entrance. Then I went inside, took the elevator to the second floor, and walked the empty space that the healthcare company would occupy in 60 days. It was big, it was quiet, it was completely mine. The future, I thought, is mine to design. And it had been all along. I've thought a lot about what it actually takes to survive something like this with your dignity intact. Not just survive it, come out the other side still recognizing yourself. And I don't think it's one thing. I think it's three things, working quietly together over a long period of time, usually without any fanfare at all. The first is integrity, not the word of the year kind that gets printed on motivational posters, the everyday, unsexy kind, where you do what you said you would do. You keep your financial house in order. You don't take shortcuts even when no one is watching. I bought that building on the corner lot in Charlotte 14 months before I got married. I paid my taxes on it. I maintained it. I released it when tenants left. I did that work in the background, year after year, with no audience and no applause. And when the moment came, when Todd stood in that driveway and tried to reduce 11 years of my life to a manila envelope, all of that quiet, unglamorous integrity was still standing. He couldn't touch it, not because I planned some elaborate revenge, but because I had simply never stopped building something real. The second is clarity. Todd saw what he wanted to see, a woman who had organized her life around the marriage, around him, around continuity. And in many ways, he wasn't wrong. I had made accommodations I shouldn't have, for longer than I should have made them. But I had never confused those accommodations with the whole of who I was. When things started to fall apart, I didn't fall apart with them. I got clear. I called Pauline. I talked to Harriet. I hired Rebecca. I moved methodically through each step because I had taken the time, years before, to understand what I actually owned. Not just in property, but in skill, in network, in the particular kind of quiet confidence that comes from having done real work over a long time. Clarity isn't something that arrives in a crisis. It's something you practice before the crisis so that when it comes, you already know where the ground is. The third is, I think, the hardest one to talk about without sounding like a self-help book. It's the decision not to define yourself by what someone else did to you. Celeste's choices, Todd's choices, they happened. They had consequences that I had to deal with financially and emotionally and practically. But at no point did I let those choices become the story of who I was. The story of who I was existed before that driveway and would continue after it. Todd underestimated me because he had stopped looking at me, really looking, somewhere in the middle of 11 years. That's his loss. I'm not going to carry it for him. What I carry is the memory of walking the second floor of that building the morning the settlement was finalized, the light coming through the new windows, the empty space that would, in 60 days, be full of people doing their work and living their days. I had made that possible, not luck, not circumstance, just years of showing up and doing the thing. I think about Pauline, who had been through her own version of this and came out sharper and more generous for it. I think about the 3 men who finally gave their statements, who had carried something heavy and alone for years and were finally allowed to put it down. There is a kind of cause and effect at work in how we treat people. Not mystical, just practical. Celeste built a pattern of harm, and that pattern eventually accumulated into something that couldn't be ignored. Todd chose willful blindness, and that choice cost him in ways he is still probably calculating. And I chose year after year to build something honest. That choice held. The future really is yours to design. But you have to start building it before you need it.